Welcome the anointed ones. Every family has a story they tell the world, and a second one they swear no one will ever notice. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't like admitting out loud. Families don't just raise children, they protect systems, and whenever a system feels threatened, it doesn't hesitate to mark someone early, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, strategically, almost politely. Which is why some of you didn't grow up feeling unsafe in the obvious way. You grew up feeling watched, like there was an invisible file with your name on it that nobody ever showed you, but everyone seemed to be updating. Psychologists have long observed that in dysfunctional family structures, roles are assigned early and rarely explained. One child becomes the peacekeeper, one becomes the golden example, and one, usually the one who notices too much, becomes the pressure valve. Studies on family systems confirm that scapegoated children often show higher awareness, stronger pattern recognition, and a lower tolerance for contradiction than their peers. In simple terms, you weren't difficult, you were inconvenient to the story. And let's be honest for a second, if families were always about love and honesty, nobody would need phrases like, "What happens in this house stays in this house." That sentence alone has done more emotional damage than most villains in movies, and it's always said with a smile like it's a warm hug instead of a legal disclaimer. What makes this even stranger is how early it starts. Before you had adult logic, before you understood power dynamics, you could feel it in the way conversations stopped when you entered rooms, in how your questions made people suddenly busy, in how jokes about you landed just a little too sharp to be harmless. You were treated like you might expose something simply by being yourself. No flashlight required. And here's the ironic part that deserves a small laugh. The very traits that made you a problem back then, your awareness, your refusal to play pretend, your habit of noticing what doesn't add up, are the same traits people now call strong intuition or high intelligence, once they're no longer responsible for dealing with you daily. This isn't about blaming parents or rewriting history for drama. This is about finally naming a pattern that explains why your childhood felt less like growing up and more like being quietly managed. Because when a family is hiding something dark, they don't start by locking doors. They start by watching the one person most likely to notice the shadows. And if that was you, this conversation is long overdue. Number 1. You were identified early as a variable they couldn't fully control. From a very young age, something about you didn't fit neatly into the family's expectations. You weren't doing anything wrong, but you weren't behaving the way the system needed you to behave either. You reacted differently. You noticed shifts in mood, tone, and tension without anyone explaining them. While other children adapted quickly to unspoken rules, you hesitated, questioned, or quietly resisted. That hesitation alone was enough to set off alarms. Families that rely on control don't panic over loud children or rebellious teens. They panic over children who don't absorb conditioning easily. You didn't internalize roles the way you were supposed to. Praise didn't fully hook you. Fear didn't fully freeze you. Even when you complied, there was a sense that you were doing it consciously, not automatically. That made you unpredictable, and unpredictability is dangerous to any system built on appearances. So the monitoring started early. Adults paid closer attention to your reactions than your actions. They watched how much you noticed, how much you remembered, how quickly you connected dots. You were corrected faster, questioned harder, and tolerated less, not because you were worse, but because you were harder to steer without explanation. You required effort, and effort exposes intent. Over time, this turned into a quiet campaign of shaping. Small discouragements, subtle invalidation, emotional pressure dressed up as guidance. The goal wasn't to break you, but to dull the parts that didn't bend easily. If they could make you doubt your instincts early enough, they wouldn't have to deal with your independence later. What's important to understand is that this wasn't always conscious or cruel in a dramatic way. Often, it was practical. The family had a story it needed to maintain, and you were a loose thread. Loose threads don't look dangerous at first, but everyone knows they eventually unravel the whole thing. That's why you were treated like a risk before you ever caused damage. You weren't punished for what you did. You were managed for what you might become. And the irony is this: the very thing they tried to control was your ability to see clearly and act intentionally. That ability never left. It just waited until you were far enough away to use it freely. Number 2. The family didn't fear your weakness, they feared your clarity. You weren't dangerous because you were loud, aggressive, or defiant. You were dangerous because you noticed things exactly as they were. You could sense when words didn't match behavior. You felt tension before arguments happened. You picked up on favoritism, shifting alliances, and emotional dishonesty without needing anyone to spell it out. That kind of clarity unsettles people who depend on denial to stay comfortable. Most families with hidden issues survive by normalizing what isn't normal. They laugh things off, change topics, or label discomfort as overthinking. You didn't do that easily. When something felt wrong, it stayed wrong to you. You didn't smooth it over just to keep peace. Even when you stayed quiet, your awareness showed in your body language, your tone, and the way you withdrew instead of pretending everything was fine. That was enough to make others uneasy. Instead of addressing what you were noticing, the focus shifted to you. You were told you were too sensitive, too serious, too intense, or looking for problems. Not because those labels were accurate, but because they redirected attention away from the real issue. If your clarity could be framed as a flaw, then the system didn't have to change. What made this harder is that clarity can't be punished directly. You weren't breaking rules, you weren't acting out, you were simply seeing clearly. So the response became subtle. Conversations happened without you. Decisions were made and then presented as facts. Emotional reactions were dismissed or minimized. Over time, the message became clear. Noticing too much came with consequences. The irony is that clarity often comes with empathy. You understood more than people realized, which meant you also felt more. That combination made it harder for others to hide behind excuses. They couldn't fully relax around you because you were a mirror, not a participant in the performance. They didn't fear that you would fall apart. They feared that you would eventually speak plainly, act independently, and stop playing along. Your clarity threatened the unspoken agreement to keep things fine. And when clarity enters a space built on avoidance, it's not welcomed, it's targeted. Number 3, you became the emotional scapegoat because you wouldn't absorb the lie. From early on, it wasn't about what you did, it was about what the family needed you to carry. Every family with a secret has invisible weights, tensions, and stories that no one wants to confront. Someone has to hold them, even if they didn't create them. In your case, that person was you. You weren't chosen because you were fragile or flawed. You were chosen because you couldn't be easily fooled. Your awareness made you a natural container for the family's unacknowledged truths. They blamed you for things that had nothing to do with you. Arguments, disappointments, and frustrations were redirected onto your shoulders because you were accessible and, crucially, observant. By making you the scapegoat, they protected the system itself. Your role wasn't accidental. You weren't just unlucky or sensitive. You were strategically assigned a burden that kept everyone else comfortable and the family's hidden realities intact. This assignment came with its own brand of isolation. Love was conditional, praise was rare, and affection often came with strings. When the family laughed, celebrated, or defended one another, you were often left out or subtly excluded. Their message was clear. You carry the tension, don't question why. And the more you resisted, the harder they pushed. They didn't need you broken, they needed you compliant, or at least distracted enough not to expose them. Scapegoating isn't always dramatic. It's quiet, persistent, and relentless. It's in the sighs when you express discomfort, the raised eyebrows when you voice truth, the careful phrasing of praise to remind you that approval is earned, never given freely. You learned early that your emotions weren't entirely yours. They were tools the family could manipulate, redirect, or dismiss to maintain appearances. The cruel brilliance of this tactic is that it made you question yourself before anyone else could. You began to doubt your perceptions, your feelings, your instincts. But here's the truth they could never change. Your instincts were correct. You weren't carrying imaginary burdens. You were the one keeping the system from completely collapsing. And while they tried to make you the problem, you were quietly the most honest part of the entire story. Number 4. Adults spoke around you instead of to you for a reason. From the earliest moments, conversations in your family were never fully open to you, not because you weren't part of the household, but because your presence threatened the narrative they wanted to control. Adults didn't always speak to you. They spoke around you. They used coded language, half-statements, or subtle references, as if your awareness might derail their carefully maintained illusions. You weren't being ignored, you were being managed. Every pause, every redirection, every "don't worry about it" was a strategic move to keep certain truths hidden while testing how much you noticed. This pattern created a unique tension. You could feel the weight of words meant for others, notice the awkward glances exchanged, and detect the unspoken undercurrents that everyone else seemed content to ignore. You weren't passive in these moments. You were absorbing, calculating, and silently measuring the distance between what was said and what was meant. Adults around you understood that if you ever connected the dots, you wouldn't just sit quietly. You might act, question, or even disrupt the story they depended on. Over time, speaking around you became habitual, and it wasn't always malicious. Some adults genuinely thought they were protecting you from information that might be confusing, dangerous, or destabilizing. But the real purpose went deeper. By filtering information and excluding you from the full truth, they maintained control over how the family story unfolded. You learned early that knowledge could be a threat in the wrong hands, and your very presence put their secrecy at risk. The result was an unspoken tension that shaped your perception of the world. You weren't simply being left out, you were being calibrated. They were watching how you processed partial truths, observing whether you'd accept them blindly or challenge them. Your reactions became a silent barometer for how far their control could extend. In essence, adults didn't speak to you because the full truth carried power they weren't ready to relinquish. That early experience left a mark. You learned to read between lines, detect inconsistencies, and recognize that silence, or speaking around someone, often tells more than words ever could. It wasn't neglect. It was containment. And in that containment, they revealed far more about themselves than they ever intended. Number 5. Adults spoke around you instead of to you for a reason. From the very beginning, you were never fully part of the conversations that mattered. Adults didn't always speak to you directly. They circled around your awareness, choosing words carefully, pausing before answering, and sometimes acting as if you weren't even there. This wasn't accidental or a sign of forgetfulness. It was deliberate. Every word left unsaid, every conversation you were excluded from, was a measure of control. They weren't protecting you. They were protecting the story they didn't want you to unravel. When you listened closely, you felt it. The half-truths, the veiled warnings, the sudden shifts in tone when you entered a room. You noticed the glances exchanged, the subtle hesitations, the small corrections, when someone almost revealed too much. You were learning a language everyone else spoke fluently, the language of concealment. And you learned it fast. That awareness, which should have been harmless curiosity, made adults tense. Your ability to pick up on inconsistencies made them nervous because you were unpredictable. They couldn't fully control what you would see or understand. The pattern wasn't always cruelly obvious. Sometimes it came wrapped in seemingly caring intentions. You're too young to understand, or it's complicated, maybe later. But behind those words was a strategy. By speaking around you, they could gauge your perception, measure your reactions, and adjust their behavior to keep the family's secrets intact. They were testing you without ever saying so, seeing whether you could be swayed, distracted, or misled. Over time, this shaped how you process information and interact with the world. You learned to read between lines, detect tension in silence, and recognize when what is left unsaid carries more weight than words themselves. That skill became a quiet armor, one that gave you insight adults around you never expected. They thought speaking around you was containment, but in reality, it was the moment they began training you to see more than they ever intended. Your awareness grew, and with it, so did your understanding of the subtle dynamics that others tried so hard to hide. Number 6. You were watched more closely than your siblings, not protected more. From the earliest moments, you weren't just growing up, you were under a microscope. Every word, every glance, every small action was observed with a quiet intensity that felt normal at the time but wasn't. It wasn't protection they were offering. It was control. While your siblings moved through the house with relative freedom, your behavior was tracked, measured, and sometimes judged before you even knew what had happened. They didn't need you to be perfect. They needed you to be predictable. The scrutiny wasn't always obvious. It came in small ways: a raised eyebrow, a subtle correction, a sigh when you expressed curiosity or frustration. The adults around you seemed calm, almost casual, but beneath that calm was calculation. They were assessing how much you noticed, how fast you learned, and how likely you were to disrupt the family narrative. They weren't watching to guide you. They were watching to understand the threat you posed simply by existing as someone who could see more than they wanted to be seen. Over time, this constant observation shaped the way you moved, spoke, and even thought. Every choice, even the smallest one, became part of a silent ledger they kept. They weren't nurturing you. They were mapping you. The irony is that the more you grew, the more that scrutiny increased, not decreased. The more capable you became, the more unpredictable you were to them, and the more carefully they had to watch. This relentless observation wasn't punishment, but it carried its own weight. You learned to anticipate moods, to measure responses, to decode silence. You became hyper-aware, not because you wanted to, but because the environment demanded it. And that awareness became your hidden advantage, even if at the time it felt like anxiety or pressure. You weren't protected more than anyone else. You were considered too significant to leave unchecked. They watched because they feared what you might discover or reveal. They watched because your clarity and potential threatened the illusions they relied on, and the very act of observing you so closely revealed more about their secrets than any conversation ever could. Number 7. Discipline was used as correction, not guidance. In your household, rules rarely existed to teach you how to navigate the world. They existed to keep you in line. Discipline wasn't about helping you understand cause and effect or shaping character. It was about controlling the unpredictable, the aware, the child who noticed too much and asked too many questions. The consequences you faced weren't proportional to mistakes. They were proportional to the threat your independence represented. Every punishment, no matter how small, was a lesson in compliance, not morality. You learned quickly that the goal wasn't fairness. One day, a misstep could be overlooked. The next, the same misstep could be met with outrage. The inconsistency wasn't random, it was strategic. It taught you to question yourself, to measure your actions, and to second-guess your instincts. Obedience wasn't optional, it was survival. And over time, you realized that no matter how well you followed the rules, the standard was constantly shifting. You weren't being corrected, you were being tested. This approach left its mark. You became hyper-aware of boundaries, both stated and unstated, and you developed an instinct for reading the moods and expectations of others. What they called discipline was really a subtle form of training. It shaped not just your behavior, but your perception of power, authority, and fairness. It taught you that appearances matter more than truth, and compliance matters more than understanding. And yet, there was a strange, hidden lesson beneath it all. You learned resilience. You learned to navigate systems built to suppress you without losing yourself entirely. You discovered how to endure scrutiny, manage expectation, and maintain clarity, even when surrounded by manipulation. While the discipline wasn't meant to guide you toward growth, it unintentionally forged a capacity for awareness and adaptability that few people develop naturally. Discipline in your family was never about shaping the best version of you. It was about shaping the version they could manage. The irony is that the very attempts to control and correct you only strengthened your ability to see clearly, resist quietly, and emerge intact. And that is a truth they could never fully anticipate. Number 8. You were blamed for conflicts that existed before you could speak. From the very beginning, the family had a system in place where accountability was never applied where it belonged. Problems, tensions, and disputes didn't just appear. They had a history, a pattern, a source. But someone had to carry the blame, and that someone became you. You weren't chosen because you did anything wrong. You were chosen because you were present, aware, and most importantly, able to be molded into a convenient scapegoat. Assigning fault to a child who doesn't fully understand the stakes is the easiest way to protect the adult's secrets while keeping the family illusion intact. You quickly learned that no mistake, or even no action at all, was safe from being twisted into evidence against you. Arguments that predated your memory were suddenly your fault. Misunderstandings and unresolved grudges became ammunition to control your behavior. By placing the weight of past conflicts on you, the family maintained a narrative that allowed them to avoid facing uncomfortable truths about themselves. The blame wasn't accidental or unfair in the usual sense. It was strategic. It preserved the story they wanted everyone to believe, and you were cast as the character whose purpose was to absorb tension and deflect attention. Over time, this created a strange psychological pattern. You learned to doubt your own sense of justice, to question your memories, and to feel guilt for things you couldn't possibly have caused. You internalized the idea that your presence alone could trigger problems, and that survival meant walking carefully, speaking cautiously, and predicting how others would react. The lesson wasn't about right or wrong, it was about compliance and endurance. But the deeper truth is that the blame didn't make you weak. It made you perceptive. Being unjustly held accountable forced you to observe the mechanics of manipulation, the way narratives are spun, and the invisible levers adults pull to maintain control. You developed a sense for inconsistencies, a radar for hidden motives, and an early understanding of power dynamics that many never acquire. They tried to make you the problem, but in reality, they revealed themselves, their secrets, their strategies, and their priorities. You weren't the source of conflict, you were the clearest mirror of it, and that clarity has followed you ever since. Number 9. Your intuition made adults uncomfortable because it exposed timing. From a very early age, your awareness of the world wasn't ordinary. It was precise, almost surgical. You noticed patterns, shifts in mood, and unspoken tensions before anyone else did. That ability, which should have been celebrated, made the adults around you uneasy. Your intuition didn't just pick up on what was happening, it picked up on when it was happening. You sensed the build-up before conflicts, the hesitation before lies were spoken, the subtle signs that something wasn't being told. Timing is everything in manipulation, and you were noticing it. That made you a problem. Adults don't get uncomfortable when children are unaware. They get uncomfortable when children are aware, especially when that awareness comes early. You didn't just see events, you saw sequences. You could tell when a conversation was being staged, when emotions were performative, and when someone was hiding a truth they didn't want you to find. Your reactions, even subtle ones, disrupted the rhythm they had relied on to maintain control. You weren't loud or confrontational, but your presence alone introduced an element of unpredictability into their system. This made your environment subtly tense. Praise and affection were often calculated, withdrawal and correction carefully timed, all to throw you off balance and make you doubt your own perceptions. They tried to manipulate your intuition, but the harder they worked, the clearer it became that you were not easily fooled. They couldn't change the fact that your internal clock noticed when things were out of alignment. Over time, this constant attunement to timing became your hidden power. You learned to anticipate moods, detect falsehoods, and recognize patterns before they fully unfolded. While they saw it as a threat, it actually gave you an extraordinary advantage, a deeper understanding of people, motives, and systems. What made them uncomfortable became your edge. They feared that your intuition would expose what they had carefully hidden for years, and in doing so, you developed a clarity that would follow you long after their scrutiny ended. Your awareness of timing wasn't a flaw, it was your survival tool, your early warning system, and ultimately your most unrecognized strength. Number 10. Emotional support was inconsistent to keep you off balance. In your family, love and care weren't steady. They were conditional, unpredictable, and strategic. Some days you were celebrated, hugged, and praised as if everything you did was remarkable. Other days, the same actions were met with indifference, criticism, or subtle disapproval. This inconsistency wasn't accidental. It was a method. By giving emotional support sporadically, the adults around you ensured that you never fully trusted your own judgment about relationships or fairness. You learned early that stability wasn't a guarantee, and that emotional reactions could be weaponized or withdrawn at any moment. This unpredictability had a hidden purpose. It kept you uncertain, constantly testing your boundaries and subtly training you to seek approval rather than act freely. When care was extended, it felt earned, like a reward for compliance. When it was withheld, it felt like punishment, even when no rule had been broken. Over time, this emotional seesaw created an environment where you were hyper-aware of moods, timing, and unspoken expectations. You weren't just navigating your own feelings. You were constantly monitoring the feelings of those around you, learning to anticipate what would trigger praise or withdrawal. The result was a finely tuned sense of observation, but also a lingering sense of instability. You became sensitive not just to what people said, but to what they didn't say, what they avoided, and the subtle signals that indicated whether affection would be given or taken away. That awareness made you highly perceptive, but it also trained you to doubt consistency in any system of care. The inconsistency wasn't about you personally, it was about control. By keeping your emotional landscape unstable, they maintained leverage over your reactions, decisions, and even your sense of self-worth. Ironically, what they intended as a way to control you became a source of strength. You learned to read people deeply, detect hidden motives, and protect your own emotional truth even when external validation was unreliable. While inconsistent support was meant to confuse and contain you, it honed your ability to navigate complexity, recognize patterns, and survive environments that were anything but safe. The instability wasn't weakness. It was training disguised as neglect, and it shaped your resilience in ways that would follow you for a lifetime. Number 11. You were trained to doubt your memory before you learned to trust it. From early on, your recollections of events, conversations, and even feelings were often challenged, dismissed, or rewritten. When you remembered things clearly, you were told you were imagining it or overreacting. When you recounted experiences honestly, you were met with corrections that didn't match what you had observed. Over time, this repeated undermining wasn't just frustrating, it was intentional. It created a subtle pattern of self-doubt, a quiet conditioning that made you question the reliability of your own mind. You weren't being confused by accident. You were being trained to defer to the family narrative. This kind of manipulation is powerful because it attacks the one thing you can't easily verify externally: your memory. When someone repeatedly tells you that your perspective is flawed, even in small ways, it accumulates. You begin second-guessing your instincts, replaying conversations in your mind to see if you got it wrong, and hesitating before trusting what you know to be true. The family doesn't need to lie outright. They just need to introduce doubt. The more you question yourself, the more predictable and manageable you become. The consequences were far-reaching. Doubting your memory affected your confidence, your voice, and your willingness to assert truth. You learned to pause, to reevaluate, to anticipate how adults would respond before speaking. This wasn't weakness, it was survival. The constant recalibration sharpened your awareness. You became skilled at noticing discrepancies, reading between the lines, and detecting the subtle ways reality was being bent around you. What they intended as control inadvertently built a mental radar that few people develop naturally. And the irony is striking. The very effort to make you uncertain didn't erase your clarity. It refined it. By the time you could step back and observe patterns as an adult, you could see the full system in operation. Every time they tried to make you question your memory, they were teaching you to look closer, think deeper, and discern truth amidst manipulation. You weren't losing trust in yourself. You were being conditioned to test it against reality, and that skill became one of your greatest hidden strengths. Number 12. Your achievements were downplayed because independence breaks leverage. From early on, any success you had was never fully celebrated. If you got good grades, it was expected. If you excelled at a skill, it was lucky, or not that impressive. If you stood out, your uniqueness was minimized or criticized. This wasn't about fairness or humility. It was about control. Your family system relied on keeping you contained, and independence threatened that containment. The moment you proved capable of thinking, acting, or succeeding on your own terms, the leverage they had over you began to slip. Downplaying achievements serves a subtle but powerful purpose. It communicates that your progress isn't entirely your own, that success isn't worthy of recognition unless it fits their narrative. By doing this, they preserved the illusion that you were still under their authority, still dependent, and still malleable. Any confidence or momentum you gained became subject to revision, reassessment, or subtle discouragement. Compliments were rare, conditional, or overshadowed by criticism. In essence, your wins weren't allowed to exist in their pure form. They were filtered through the lens of control. Over time, this constant reframing shapes how you view accomplishment. You start questioning whether your effort truly matters, whether your talents are legitimate, or whether recognition is ever authentic. That self-doubt, is exactly what the system relies on. But beneath the discouragement, a different truth was forming. You were learning to validate yourself internally. You didn't need their approval to recognize your own capabilities, and that awareness quietly eroded their control. The irony is that the very act of downplaying you sharpened your independence. Every minimized success became fuel for self-reliance. You developed resilience and determination not in spite of their behavior, but because of it. The attempt to keep you dependent and small only revealed that your power and autonomy could not be contained. By trying to rewrite your achievements, they unknowingly trained you to measure your value by your own standards. What they feared most wasn't arrogance or rebellion. It was that you would eventually realize your true worth, fully independent of their approval, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Number 13. You were discouraged from speaking outside the family for a reason. From early on, there was an invisible boundary drawn around you. Conversations with friends, teachers, or even distant relatives were subtly and sometimes overtly limited. The message was clear: what happens in this house stays in this house. It wasn't about protection from the outside world. It was about protecting the family's narrative. Your voice, sharp and aware as it was, carried the potential to expose truths they had carefully hidden. By discouraging you from speaking outward, they controlled not just what you knew, but what others could know through you. This discouragement often came disguised as concern. Don't share too much. It's complicated. Or, you wouldn't understand if you told anyone. Each phrase reinforced the idea that the family story was sacrosanct and that your input was dangerous. The effect was subtle but profound. You internalized the belief that speaking up could have consequences, that your perspective was unsafe, and that discretion was survival. Over time, this trained you to filter your words, hesitate before sharing, and weigh the impact of every disclosure, even the harmless ones. The restriction wasn't only about secrecy, it was about control and leverage. The more contained your communication, the easier it was to maintain authority, manipulate perception, and keep the family system intact. Your insights, observations, and instincts were potentially destabilizing. They knew that once you shared what you saw, their carefully constructed illusions would begin to crumble. By keeping you quiet, they preserved appearances, and by keeping you uncertain, they maintained dominance over your autonomy. Ironically, what was meant to silence you often strengthened your discernment. You became attuned to what could be dangerous to reveal, and learned to navigate complex dynamics with subtlety. You developed a quiet awareness of timing, discretion, and influence, skills that gave you a hidden advantage over those who underestimated your perception. The attempts to limit your voice didn't suppress it, they refined it. And once you realized the power of your own clarity, speaking outside the family wasn't reckless, it was transformative. They tried to cage your words, but they couldn't cage the truth you carried, and that truth always finds a way to surface. Number 14. You didn't escape the system, you outgrew it. Growing up in a family with hidden agendas and unspoken rules often feels like being trapped inside a game you didn't choose to play. At first, you follow the rules because survival depends on it. You learn the patterns, the expectations, and the delicate balance required to avoid conflict or scrutiny. You adapt, sometimes perfectly, sometimes reluctantly, and you begin to understand the invisible threads that hold the household together. But the more you grow, the more those threads feel confining. You don't leave because you're weak or naive. You leave because your awareness, independence, and clarity have outpaced the system itself. Outgrowing the system isn't a dramatic escape. It's gradual, almost imperceptible at first. You start questioning why certain behaviors are normalized, why contradictions are tolerated, and why truth is so often twisted. You recognize manipulation, favoritism, and inconsistencies, and you understand that no apology or explanation will change the fundamental structure that controls everyone else. What you once accepted as family dynamics begins to feel like a carefully constructed cage. The rules that applied to you are no longer relevant to the person you've become. As your perspective expands, distance, emotional, physical, or both, becomes inevitable. You aren't abandoning anyone, you're reclaiming space for your own truth. You see clearly the mechanisms of control that others rely on, and you realize that compliance is no longer necessary. Independence, insight, and self-trust have replaced fear, obligation, and doubt. The system loses power not because it is defeated, but because you are no longer a participant in its game. The irony is that outgrowing the system often reveals it in full for the first time. Once you step back, the patterns, manipulations, and secrets become obvious, and you can finally see who was shaping whom. What seemed oppressive becomes instructive. You carry the lessons, the awareness, and the clarity forward, but the cage no longer defines your movement. You don't escape. It's simply that the structure can no longer contain the person you have become, and nothing inside that old system has the power to pull you back in. Conclusion: what becomes clear when you step back and look at the full picture is that your childhood wasn't just a series of isolated moments of confusion, pain, or frustration. It was a carefully orchestrated environment designed to shape, test, and contain you without ever fully revealing its purpose. From the very beginning, you were watched, measured, and guided, not for your benefit, but to preserve a system that depended on secrecy, control, and compliance. Every subtle correction, every inconsistent show of affection, every misdirection was part of a pattern meant to keep you off balance, while the adults around you maintained their narrative. And yet, in all of that, there was an unintended consequence. You emerged with clarity, intuition, and resilience that few ever develop. You weren't weak, you weren't flawed, you weren't the problem. You were the anomaly the system couldn't contain, the child who noticed too much, felt too deeply, and understood too early. The same traits that made you a target were the traits that ensured your survival, your growth, and eventually, your freedom. You learned to read between the lines, detect patterns, question authority, and trust your instincts when others tried to make you doubt yourself. You didn't escape the system by chance. You outgrew it. You weren't silenced. You simply became someone who could see beyond the walls that were built to contain you. Now, as an adult, the lessons you carry are invaluable. The experiences that once felt isolating and unfair are the foundation for the clarity, strength, and independence that define you today. Every moment of scrutiny, doubt, and manipulation honed a perception and resilience that no one can take away. You understand power, control, and truth in a way that those who tried to suppress you never could. The awareness you hold is your legacy, and the insight you've gained is not just survival. It's mastery over the system that once sought to define you. If this resonated with you, and you're ready to continue uncovering the truths hidden in plain sight, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more deep, revealing insights. Like this video if it opened your eyes, comment below with your thoughts or experiences, and share it with someone who needs to see the reality of these hidden patterns. Every click, every comment, and every share helps spread the knowledge and empowers more people to see clearly, just as you have. Don't stay silent. Let the truth be known, and let your awareness guide you forward. God bless you. Bless.